I'm delighted to have a very distinguished guest on this occasion, Dr. David Adler, the President of the Australian Jewish Association and former Deputy Secretary to the Australian Medical Association. Welcome, Dr. Adler.
Thank you, Professor David Flint, and it's always a privilege to join you for a discussion.
Well, thank you. I must say that I'm not ashamed to be an Australian, but I am very disappointed about the situation as it now seems to me in Australia. We have our foreign policy being determined, according to a prominent member of the Labour Party, by asking to what extent can this policy be defended from the steps of the Lakemba Mosque. And then we have the situation in the states. And for this I blame the state governments, the state premiers, for allowing this to happen, in which we have seen, since those dreadful events in October 2 years ago in Israel, where we had this shocking invasion of Israel by Hamas, where unspeakable butcheries were committed. And we had that demonstration which followed outside on the Opera House, where the government of New South Wales, the police in New South Wales, shepherded the mob to the Opera House, tolerated a riot, which was not followed by any police action. And that seems to me to be replicated constantly in Australia, where the rule of law is not being applied, the law is not being enforced, and what happened at the Opera House was obviously a breach of the law. All that fuss about whether the new section would or wouldn't work is complete rubbish. And I was shocked by that. And then you had the police spending much of their time by engaging in some specialist who came to the ridiculous conclusion that what was being chanted, the disgusting chant of "Gas the Jews," was actually "Where's the Jews," which is not even idiomatic and certainly wasn't what everybody heard at the time. I find this absolutely appalling, and I blame myself, I blame the federal government, the Albanese government, the way in which they've behaved in the United Nations, the way they've changed traditional policy. But I also blame Mr. Minns, who seems to be a very good man and speaks well about these issues. But somebody in New South Wales has told the New South Wales police not to fully enforce the law as they would in relation to anybody else, and a similar thing is happening in Victoria. I found the situation appalling. I know in some instances you can't speak in some areas, but I'd be delighted to hear your views on how you regard the situation in Australia at the moment.
Well, there's quite a lot in that introduction, Professor Flint, and I'm certainly not ashamed to be an Australian. We've had a lot of people tell us, we love Australia, but we are ashamed of the Australian government. They draw that distinction. And certainly the behaviour of the current federal government has been extremist. It's been the most hostile ever to Israel, to the only democratic ally in the Middle East. And many of the policies that it's introduced downstream from that has caused enormous trauma to the Jewish community in Australia. And you're quite right to highlight the events of October 9 at the Opera House. And I'd like to remind people that the actual terrorism, the invasion of Israel by Hamas, thousands of terrorists, and the barbarity that was undertaken was 7 October. So we're talking 2 days later, when Israel hadn't even responded. It wasn't possible to protest any responsive actions by Israel because there weren't any. And so when they started the various chants that were anti-Semitic, there's no dispute that F the Jews was said. There was no dispute that there were calls for an intifada, which is a violent uprising. There is a dispute of where's the Jews versus gas the Jews. And I guess it's possible both words were said. We do have statutory declarations from people who heard gas the Jews. And the question which remains completely unanswered at least not satisfactorily, is why the law was not enforced on the 9th of October, because it set the tone for the subsequent 15 months. Now, I know from a security expert that there is high-resolution CCTV monitoring all around the Opera House. If the government was of the mind, they could instruct that facial recognition technology be applied to that CCTV. They could identify the people who let off flares, who burnt flags, who shouted this incitement repeatedly, and we think that there was already terrorist flags being displayed, in particular a flag of Hezbollah. And because there was no effective law enforcement except for a couple of Jews that turned up and they were arrested or moved on, those thugs who are pushing the boundaries of violence have been emboldened. And we've seen more and more and more. And of course, just in the last week or so, the firebombing of a synagogue follows protests in Melbourne, follows protests against the Great Synagogue in Sydney, follows on from the vandalism of cars in Wallara, the encampments on the universities. This is not the Australia we want. And at the end of the day, it is our political leaders who must bear responsibility. And I got a call earlier in the day, I'll share with you, from a Vietnam veteran. And he said to me, I fought for this country, but I didn't fight for the anti-Semitism on the streets. I didn't fight for the mobs. I fought for our democratic values. And all his veteran mates won't be voting for the current government in the next election, according to what he told me. So we hang on to the hope that there is a silent majority out there of good, reasonable Aussies who, in a few months' time, will express their judgment via the ballot box, and hopefully they'll make a wise decision.
What I found extraordinary among the many statements of the foreign minister, Ms. Wong, was that she said that we pay respect to the neutrality, I suppose, or whatever words she used, of the International Criminal Court. As you know, the International Criminal Court has shown how biased it is, just in the very people it chose for the chamber to decide on the warrants for the arrest of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Defence Minister. And I am surprised to the extent to which the federal government has changed what was very much a bipartisan foreign policy in relation to the only democracy in the Middle East, as we know, and our ally, Israel. And I find this extraordinary that the government would go ahead and change foreign policy on the basis of advantage, apparent advantage in relation to the next election.
Well, the International Criminal Court, as many people know, is actually an arm of the United Nations. It's not independent. It has political appointments to it, and its role, established shortly after the Holocaust, was to have a sort of a fallback legal system in the event that a country did not have a functioning legal system. And Israel has a very robust legal system. And senior politicians have been tried, have been convicted by courts. There is no question that should there be any inappropriate conduct, as a functioning democracy with separation of powers, it can be dealt with internally. An interesting observation as we look also in that area, Syria it looks like the Assad regime has fallen, and that Assad has fled, some would say he is responsible for well over 500,000 deaths, torture prisons, chemical weapon use, potentially some of the worst crimes against humanity. The ICC has not issued any warrant against him, nor against many other prominent people in the world who have committed the most heinous crimes. So again, we have this outrage, I think, that the foreign policy for Australia seems to be shifting, either driven by extreme left ideology, because the current Labor government is not like previous Labor governments of Hawke, Keating, even Gillard and Rudd. This is a much more left-wing, much more radical government. So perhaps it's extremist ideology, and perhaps it's looking at internal electoral priorities. And if you do the numbers, it's a no contest. We have a little over 100,000 Jewish people in Australia. We have a bit over 800,000 Muslims, many of whom would have a very dim view about the state of Israel. And if you're a backroom numbers cruncher for political purposes, that is, it's not a great loss to throw the Jewish people under a bus, to throw Israel under a bus, so to speak. It's undemocratic. It's not in Australia's national interest, but if you're looking at your domestic political electoral priorities, it makes sense. So we think Penny Wong is being driven both by ideological extremism and wanting to be returning for another term as Foreign Minister, where the journey that she's on can be continued.
Only about 15% of the world constitute countries which live under the rule of law, which are functioning democracies. And it seems to me to be somewhat ridiculous that we would put the fate of Australia in the hands of any organisation which is dominated by about 85% of countries which are corrupt dictatorships and so on. The unfortunate people are ruled by these. And it seems very silly, for example, for Australia to ever joined the International Criminal Court. I remember at the time there was a great division within the Liberal Party. Alexander Downer recently revealed that apparently he was in favour and John Howard was against. The cabinet was almost equally divided. They took it to the party and there was a slight preference for joining, and they made the mistake of joining. I think most people now would say we should pull out of the International Criminal Court. One of the things that Ms. Wong has agreed to, and the government has agreed to at the United Nations, is a resolution which includes the premise that Israel has an unlawful presence in the occupied territories, an unlawful presence in the occupied territories. Well, that seems to be an extraordinary statement, that that presence of Israel there. They're talking about Judea and Samaria, the area of that part of the world, which was part of the British mandate, was it not? The British mandate of Palestine. So how could the successor state have an unlawful presence in those occupied territories, as they say?
Well, you have a historical knowledge that perhaps Penny Wong does not. It was indeed part of the British mandate, which was established in the 1920s, and the purpose of the mandate was to restore the Jewish homeland, and it was confirmed by the then League of Nations and subsequently by the United Nations. But it's more than just Judea-Samaria. The definition, according to DFAT, our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, includes Gaza, includes the Golan Heights, includes the old city of Jerusalem. So what this resolution is in effect saying is that the old city of Jerusalem, with the Jewish quarter, with the Temple Mount, where Solomon's temple stood, having a Jewish presence there is somehow wrong. It's a nonsense. It's not only contrary to religious principles, it's contrary to history. We believe it's contrary to international law, as do many legal experts, and there have been video documentaries produced which demonstrate that. There has been no other entity which has had Jerusalem as its capital other than the ancient Israel and now the modern Israel. There has never been a sovereign Palestinian state. There is no actual sovereign claim. Jordan no longer claims it. They occupied Judea, Samaria for a while. There is no sovereign entity that has a claim other than Israel. And for peace purposes, offers have been made to the Arab Palestinian leadership. And very interestingly, former US President Bill Clinton has recently, on speaking circuits, explained the generosity of the offers that were made to establish a state of Palestine, and they were constantly rejected. The truth is nowadays, nobody in the Middle East, or hardly anybody in the Middle East, wants such a thing. For quite different reason. The Jews don't want it because they see the potential for a giant Gaza, a terrorist entity.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the radicalised Arabs don't want it because they frankly want Israel eliminated. They don't want to live side by side with a Jewish state. So it has zero chance at the moment of proceeding. And then one last point, David, which is worth making. This goes way further. Australia is way more radical now in its foreign policy than even the Biden-Harris administration. America did not support these radical resolutions. And of course, with the Trump administration taking over on the 20th of January, Australia is not just distancing itself in foreign policy from Israel, it's distancing itself significantly from our largest and most important ally, the United States of America.
I think that's a very important point, and you also pointed out, and I had missed the point, that what Ms. Wong is saying to Israel is, you are unlawfully present in your capital, which is so ridiculous. But just finally, what do you expect from the presidency of Donald Trump? This will make a very big change, won't it, in the attitude of the West and in relation to the support which he will give, no doubt, to Israel?
100%. And you can look at his track record when he was president previously, and perhaps the glowing achievement was the Abraham Accords, the establishment of normalisation arrangements between Israel and 4 Arab countries in the area, an achievement that for decades no one else had been able to deliver. And some of the people he's appointed already for the administration are outstanding. Mike Huckabee is going to be the American ambassador to Israel, and other appointments we think have said some outstanding things. If they're able to deliver the policies that they're articulating at the moment, there is a good chance that the conflicts can be dissipated, and hopefully the Abraham Accords can be re-established and widened, and who knows, maybe even Saudi Arabia, which would join, which would be a bit of a game changer for the region.
Well, President Trump made much of the observation that when he survived the assassination, many Americans thought this is the hand of Providence. Well, perhaps in international affairs, his arrival may well be, in many ways, many people may well believe that this is the hand of Providence in relation to securing peace in the Middle East. And you were so right. And even when we know that when that attempt was made to have the Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia, that was probably the stimulus that caused Iran to encourage Hamas to that terrible, that uncivilized, that brutal, butchering invasion of Israel, which was such an outrage.
Mm. Yeah. Well, we're holding on to the hope that internationally, January 20 will be a bit of a turnaround, and Australia is due for an election sometime in the next few months. Some of the leaders in the current government have been outrageously bad, in our view, on foreign policy and in failure to deal with important domestic security issues, and of course the anti-Semitism. And who knows, Australia might see a turnaround within the next 6 months begin as well.
Let us hope so. Once again, Dr. Adler, thank you so much for your contribution, and thank you for fighting for these important principles.
And thank you, and let's hope we can save the nation.
Indeed, let's do that.